Hi, I'm Joe Milowic. I'm a partner at Quinn Emanuel and a founder of the Lawyers Depression Project. As Ivan Fong, Senior VP of Legal Affairs and General Counsel of 3M recently stated, corporate counsel are no different from outside lawyers in dealing with depression, anxiety, and substance abuse. We continue to face workplace stress and the pressure to do more with less. This is the way the world is changing and adapting, and we want to be proactive in responding to the increased pressure that we're all facing. According to the ABA, an important area warranting considerable attention is the stigma of mental health and substance use disorders that prevents lawyers from seeking help. The ABA's National Task Force report identified a number of factors that hinder lawyers seeking help, including failure to recognize symptoms, not knowing how to identify or access appropriate treatment, or believing it to be a hassle to do so, a culture's negative view of such conditions, fear of adverse reactions by others whose opinions are important, feeling ashamed, viewing help seeking as a sign of weakness, having a strong preference for self-reliance or a tendency towards perfectionism, fear of career repercussions and concerns about confidentiality, uncertainty about the quality of organizationally provided therapists or otherwise doubting that treatment will be effective, and finally, lack of time and busy schedules. According to the ABA, the most effective way to reduce stigma is through contact with lawyers who have personally experienced a relevant disorder. Today, you'll meet 4 such attorneys who are here to share their stories with you. When we talk about things that can negatively affect a lawyer's ability to practice law, whether that is substance use disorder or depression, it's natural to want some context. Just how big a problem is this in our society generally? Are lawyers more likely to suffer from depression than people who work in other jobs, including jobs that are also highly demanding and stressful, like doctors? Knowing how to identify the common symptoms of depression is an important step toward getting help. Typical signs of depression include depressed mood that may present as feeling sad, empty, or hopeless, a noticeable decreased interest in activities that were once pleasurable, eating too much or too little, sleeping too much or too little, fatigue or loss of energy, trouble concentrating or trouble making even basic decisions, and thoughts of harming yourself. While these are common symptoms of major depressive disorder, it's important to note that depression affects everyone differently. For some people, it may present as mood swings with highs and lows. For others, it could mean irritability or a pervasive low mood, sometimes lasting for years at a time. Unfortunately, for many people, these challenges can have a significant impact on their day-to-day functioning. After understanding the typical signs of depression, people often ask, how is depression different from regular sadness? That's a great question, because sadness is one of the primary symptoms of depression, and it can seem hard to distinguish between the two. But here's the difference. Depression is more than just sadness, and not simply by a measure of degree. It isn't just how deeply you feel sad, but rather it's the whole mix of factors, including how long you have these negative feelings, how those feelings are affecting your body, and your ability to function in your daily life. While everyone experiences sadness in his or her life, for example, when a loved one dies or a relationship ends, those bouts of sadness can be traced to a specific person or event. Sadness that is a symptom of depression doesn't have a specific trigger. You simply feel sad or hopeless about everything. Even if you have every reason in the world to feel happy, not only do you feel sad instead, but you lose the ability to experience joy or pleasure. When you're sad, you can still enjoy your favorite TV show, food, spending time with your friends. But when you're depressed, even the things that you once enjoyed no longer interest you or give you pleasure. Finally, thoughts of self-harm don't arise from non-depressive sadness. People with depression may have thoughts of self-harm, death, or suicide, or have a suicide plan. Now that we know what depression is, why should we be concerned about it? There are many reasons, but the most important one is the one I just alluded to. Depression is associated with high mortality, much of which is accounted for by suicide. For this reason, if you think you or someone you know may be suffering from depression, it's important to recognize the warning signs and to take any suicidal statements extremely seriously. We'll talk more later about how you can get help for yourself or others who may need it. And thankfully, resources are available to lawyers in every state including organizations that offer help on a confidential basis. Turning back to our initial questions, how prevalent is depression? About 6.6% of US adults experienced a major depressive episode in a recent year, according to a study by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration, SAMHSA. That may not seem like a lot, but there are 325 million people living in the US, which means that about 20 million people suffer a depressive episode. As you might expect, depression is not evenly distributed among the population. Age, sex, education level, and race, as well as employment status, are among the variables that can determine whether someone is more or less likely to suffer from depression. As lawyers, we want to know whether people who work in our profession are more likely to suffer from depression than people who have other jobs, such as doctors. A few studies have been done that shed some light on this question. An early study of the prevalence of depression across various occupations by researchers at Johns Hopkins University found that the prevalence of depression among lawyers was 10%, so considerably more than what we see in the general population. A more recent study by Johns Hopkins grouped lawyers along with judges and legal support workers and found a lower rate of 7.1%, though still more than the general population. One study that has gotten a lot of attention is a 2016 study conducted by the Hazelton Betty Ford Foundation and the American Bar Association Commission on Lawyer Assistance Programs. The study involved a survey of more than 12,000 licensed, employed attorneys from across the country, and it found significant levels of depression, anxiety, and stress, with 28%, 19%, and 23% of the attorneys reporting that they were experiencing mild or higher levels of depression, anxiety, and stress, respectively. In terms of career prevalence, 46% reported concerns with depression at some point in their career. These are sobering data points, and ones I think align well with our intuition about one aspect of our jobs that is common to most lawyers: stress. If you think about one definition of stress, the discrepancy between the demands of a situation and the capacity of the individual or group to deal with it comfortably, and then you think about the day in and day out practice of law, it's easy to see why lawyers can become stressed out and why so many become depressed. What about suicide among lawyers? Are lawyers more prone to suicide than people with other jobs? In general, suicide in the United States is on the rise. From 2000 to 2016, the suicide rate among the working population in the US, people from 16 to 64 years of age, increased from 12.9 to 17.3 per 100,000 people. Suicide is another problem that varies greatly among people based on socio-demographic differences, such as age, sex, education level, and race. Some studies have tried to isolate the effect of one's occupation on suicide rates, but the data do not allow us to draw clear conclusions about lawyers vis-a-vis other professions. One thing we know for certain about suicide among lawyers is that it does happen, and it often makes the news and prompts the question, why would someone who has achieved so much professionally and seemingly has so much to live for do such a thing? In many cases, the answer is the lawyer suffered from depression, and if it goes untreated, depression can lead to suicide. Unfortunately, one of the other telling statistics about depression is only about half of the people who suffer receive treatment. And of those who do receive treatment, fewer than half of them receive care consistent with published guidelines. While I can't speak to the specifics of any individual cases, I can speak to the experience of suffering from depression while working in the high-stress environment of big law. I have felt the hopelessness, the lack of meaning, the loss of interest, the ruminating on negative thoughts that come with depression. I know the stress that comes with building up a reputation among colleagues and clients and trying to maintain that reputation as someone who always comes through, someone who's always on 24/7, willing to pull all-nighters and run through walls. I know what it feels like to believe that I need to prove my worth on every assignment. I know what it feels like to feel like a fraud when the negative thoughts tell me I'm not worth it. And I know how it feels to isolate, to not want to get out of bed, and to see no way out. For a long time, I didn't feel comfortable admitting this to my colleagues for fear of being perceived as incapable or unproductive. But it is my truth, and it's an illness like any other illness that deserves to be recognized and treated as such without fear of stigmatization. I had my initial diagnosis of major depression over a decade ago. I went to my primary care physician complaining of exhaustion and lack of energy. I had no idea what was wrong with me, and neither did my doctor. She diagnosed me with pre-hypertension, put me on a low-carb diet, and referred me to a diabetes specialist. I monitored my blood glucose levels strictly, but the lethargy and lack of energy and motivation only seemed to get worse. I was dwelling on my thoughts, consumed by an endless loop of anxiety and negativity. I was losing weight and losing interest in everything. I questioned the purpose of my work and even life. What was the point of it all? Why spend so many hours working at a job that seemed so pointless? I remember suffering from terrible anxiety, and I didn't know what it was called at the time. I would go out running to try to shake it. And one night, while running around a track outside my apartment, I was so besieged by thoughts that everything was meaningless that I fell to my knees and screamed to make those thoughts stop. I was convinced there was no point to my job. It was contributing to my illness. It actually made a lot of sense. So I decided I would quit my job and just find something else. I didn't know what, but I knew I could not do this job anymore because it was making me sick. I sent an email to the diabetes specialist telling him that I had decided to leave my job because it lacked meaning for me, and it was making me sick, though I noted that everything seemed to lack meaning for me. It was a cry for help. I was lost. Fortunately, he recognized the symptoms and referred me to a psychiatrist, who quickly diagnosed me with major depression. I was enrolled in an experimental study for a new drug called Lexapro, and after a few weeks, I began to feel better. I found meaning in things again, the beauty in a smile, a butterfly, or a bird flying by, a good book, a job well done. It was obvious from outside depression that I had been ill. I realized too why depression is so dangerous. When your mind is ill, you can actually believe that there's no point to anything, including living. And unfortunately, sometimes when you don't realize you're sick, the results can be tragic, particularly for those we leave behind. Depression has a way of making things seem like they will never get better. If you notice yourself exhibiting signs of depression, you can get help. There's an incredible array of resources available to all of us. First, I recommend that you go to your primary treating doctor if you're feeling depressed. Ask for a complete physical to rule out other possible causes of a mood disorder. The individual causes of depression are diverse, and each individual may present with a unique set of symptoms. If your treating doctor is not able to refer you to a psychiatrist, your state's Lawyer's Assistance Program can refer you to a psychiatrist or other licensed mental health professional. Every state has a Lawyer Assistance Program, LAP. There are several in Canada and one in the UK. The mission of an LAP is to provide free and completely confidential assistance to attorneys, judges, law students, bar applicants, staff, and family members who are affected by mental health and/or substance use disorders. LAPs provide comprehensive assessment, supportive counseling, intervention, treatment planning, and referrals to professionals with expertise working with legal professionals. Next, talk therapy with a psychologist or other licensed health professional has been shown to be effective in treating depression. Seeing a therapist can be a powerful tool. Unlike medications, which may be helpful in treating biological sources of depression, therapy offers the advantage of getting to the root of our issues and teaching coping strategies to change the way we view and deal with our problems. From personal experience, I can tell you that I have found benefit in both medicine and talk therapy. Many people I know treat their depression with a combination of medicine, prescribed by a doctor or a psychiatrist, and therapy. There are also wonderful books on cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT, and positive psychology. One of my personal favorites is Feeling Good by Dr. Burns, which focuses on CBT. Dr. Burns discusses the 10 most common cognitive distortions that contribute to depressed moods, and he teaches techniques to address them. For example, some of us fall into the trap of all or nothing thinking. We say things as black and white and may start to catastrophize as a result, when in truth, there are many other options available. Another common cognitive distortion is what he calls shouldy thinking. We set up rules in our mind of what we should be doing. Because by definition, we're not doing those things, we're therefore violating our rules, and we become stressed. These become problematic when we set up rules that cannot possibly be satisfied. And this is something, perfectionism, that many lawyers are familiar with. Another is what he calls fortune telling, where we think we know what the future will bring, and then we stress or worry about it. This is similar to catastrophizing. The truth is, we really do not know what tomorrow will bring. Another is what he refers to as viewing things through a negative filter, where we fall into the trap of ignoring everything else, but focusing only on what we perceive as negative. In a sense, we're taking issue with one or more things about the present moment, or about our life and focusing on that item to the exclusion of everything else. It really is a great resource, and I highly recommend the book. In addition, mindfulness. It's a powerful technique. It's just a fancy way of saying being mindful of the present moment, not getting caught up in thought or needless dwelling on the past or fretting about the future. Yoga, meditation, Tai Chi, and Qigong are great ways to quiet the mind and focus on the present moment. Cycling, surfing, rock climbing, other intense activities force you into the present moment. And it's difficult to worry about your legal work when you're trying to balance on one leg in a yoga pose or to stand on your board on a big wave. Mindfulness, which plays a big part in DBT or dialectical behavioral therapy, is growing in popularity and becoming a big business today in the West. Of course, it's old news in the East, where mindfulness was popular thousands of years ago to the Buddhists, Taoists, and Hindus, among others. If you're interested in mindfulness, you might enjoy reading The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle. I also recommend mindfulness apps like Aware, Headspace, and others, which will teach you how to meditate. There are also other treatments available that may be right for you as determined by your treating medical professionals. Finally, and this goes for all of us, let's remember to prioritize ourselves. Good sleep, a balanced diet, and regular exercise are essential. But people get sick, right? When you get the flu or food poisoning, you call out sick. No big deal. You go in for surgery, you let your colleagues know. The work has to either wait or be handled by someone else. But what about depression? What if you're not comfortable telling your colleagues about your condition, but you really would like to take a mental health day or a week or a month to get things together? These are difficult questions, and I'm not going to pretend to have the answer. My personal experience with disclosing my condition has been very positive thus far. It has now been 8 months since I publicly disclosed my struggles with depression. My partners, clients, and colleagues have all reached out to me to express their support and gratitude for my speaking out. My colleagues are extremely supportive, sensitive of my personal time, and we seem to connect more genuinely as human beings as a result of this window of honesty and vulnerability having been opened. Many colleagues have also shared with me their own personal stories, which they've not disclosed more broadly. My personal experience suggests that the majority of people are sensitive to mental health concerns, thanks in part to the 6 degrees of separation concept, or in this case, the 6 degrees of depression, or more likely 2 or 3 degrees. They've either experienced a mental health issue directly, or at least they're connected to someone, like family or friends, or they've tragically lost a loved one. A disclosure is a very personal decision, and there are surely those who may not react the way you would hope. But I am hopeful. As more and more lawyers feel able to openly start talking about mental health issues publicly, our collective knowledge and empathy will continue to grow. Several in-house attorneys were willing to share their personal stories with me so that I can share them with you. Our first story is about Bobby Sue.
My name is Bobby Sue Doyle Hazard. I'm the Assistant General Counsel for the NFL's Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and I am open about my mental health condition. When I was a kid, my mom suffered from severe bipolar disorder. She still does. I lost my biological dad when I was 8 years old, and I grew up in a pretty generally abusive household. When I was 13 is when I was first diagnosed with depression and some anxiety, and this continued for me into college. I sought help from a therapist from time to time, and I only shared my condition with really my closest friends. During law school, my mother suffered a manic breakdown and got access to and began spending my student loan money. Because of this, I suffered severe anxiety and I sought treatment. I took medication and saw a therapist, but I hid my condition and the fact that I was taking medicine from most people in my life, including those I dated. I was inspired by Robin Williams' suicide, however, to be open about my condition. I remember writing this very long post on Facebook acknowledging that I had been living with depression and anxiety and telling people that it's okay. Through Twitter and in my work, I started to slowly open up and talk about my experiences, and of course on Facebook. Given my openness at work, I believe that others are more likely to come to me when they are struggling with a personal issue. I also feel more aware when something is bothering someone, and I'll check in on them. I'll offer an empathetic ear and point them in the right direction for help. I now speak publicly about mental health and wellness, and I remind people that it's okay to not be okay. An important message is the importance of taking care of yourself. The work is always going to be there, and at some point in the day, you need to stop working. So put the phone down, prioritize sleep, eating well, exercising, and connecting with others, and practice gratitude each day. Whether you wish to be open about your condition is a very personal decision and depends on your circumstances and your organization. I'm extremely lucky to be part of an organization that supports my openness as a mental health advocate.
Next, we'll hear from an associate at a big law firm. Here's her story.
I was a relatively rare species of junior big law associate, happy, fulfilled, and most days, I loved practicing law. Things were on track. But I was pulling all-nighters, sleeping under my desk, not exercising, and not taking care of myself. These circumstances placed my health in jeopardy. But I was young and resilient, and it was my time to work hard and prove myself, so I plowed forward. Life had other plans, however. An immediate family member who was very ill was hospitalized. The same week, at our firm's summer associate event, a mentor of mine who struggled with alcohol dependency got out of control and forced his way into a taxi with me. I had to physically fend him off, and I reported the incident to firm management the next day. In the weeks and months that followed, I developed insomnia, and then couldn't get out of bed during the day. I was heavy, like I had on gravity boots, and felt totally devoid of any feeling. I berated myself to just get my act together, and blamed myself when I couldn't. It never occurred to my overachieving, high-functioning, perfectionist brain that my body's chemistry had fundamentally shifted from the stress and trauma of recent events. Fortunately, I was already speaking to a therapist about coping with my family member's illness, and when she suggested I might be clinically depressed, I felt relief and some hope. I knew enough to know that depression was an illness, and illness could be treated. While things did improve, my path back to health was neither short nor straightforward. It required many attempts at different medication combinations and continued therapy, sometimes twice a week. And even then, I wasn't fully back to myself until my doctors also successfully treated a related thyroid condition. I have had colleagues and friends in and out of the law who have been wonderfully supportive and understanding, but I never felt truly comfortable being completely open, often feeling the need to come up with vague and partial explanations for my path. Things have come full circle. 15 years later, I am once again a partner track associate at a big law firm. I am healthy, and yes, I still love being a lawyer. But this time around, I am determined to be honest about my experiences, and I have shared my struggles with depression with my law firm, and they have been very supportive. I also am sure to practice the necessary self-care and provide an example to the more junior attorneys that mental illness is not something you have to navigate on your own and in secret.
Let's now turn to the story of an in-house attorney who works largely from his home in a small to medium-sized enterprise. Here is what he shared with me.
First, there is a sense of isolation working as an in-house attorney. Typically, working for a small to medium-sized enterprise, you may be the only person in the company in a particular legal position. The sense of isolation results from a lack of peer support, for example, a lack of connection with the wider legal profession, a feeling of being underappreciated because in-house legal work can be esoteric and irrelevant to most other employees, and the personal satisfaction of doing a good piece of work is merely personal because other people at the company don't care or understand. Second, responsibility is the other big thing, and combined with a sense of isolation led to my more depressive episodes. As an associate in a law firm, I found contentious cases interesting or challenging. You win and lose cases, and that's life. But as a sole in-house practitioner, I felt more personally invested in everything. The consequences of losing a litigation I was managing were profound because the company could go under and hundreds of colleagues could all lose their jobs. Ultimately, I became unable to separate work from home. Things felt out of my control. I went to bed fretting and I woke up fretting. So I suffered from insomnia, which just exacerbated everything. I was also drinking too much, seeking an escape. It goes without saying that working long hours, stress, not sleeping, and drinking too much did not make for a happy home life. Eventually, and too late, I saw a doctor because the insomnia felt like it was killing me. His advice was to exercise. It's a no-brainer, but hearing it from a doctor was actually helpful. I took up cycling, and it has helped with the sleeping, my drinking, and my mood generally. It's not as if the exercise has solved everything, but it has definitely made things better. Do I have any advice for other in-house attorneys? First, make time in your life for some exercise. Go walking for an hour or cycle to work. It sounds obvious, but the difference it can make is real. Second, don't isolate yourself as an aloof corporate lawyer. Most people at my workplace are not corporate people. They work on interesting projects. They work in teams. They are clever. They can be trusted. And they are, to their credit, not lawyers. I don't think it's good enough to say my office door is always open. You need to actually walk outside your office and chew the fat with people, and they won't come to you because you're the company lawyer. I find it that not only does it help with that sense of isolation, but it helps you do better work and give better advice.
Now, he touched on drinking to cope with his stress. As you can imagine, substance use disorders are often related to an underlying mental health issue. Lisa Smith, another New York City lawyer and the author of the memoir, Girl Walks Out of a Bar, openly discusses her struggles with depression and the fact that she self-medicated it from a very young age. That self-medication ultimately led her into substance use disorder with alcohol and cocaine. Lisa believes in the disease model of substance use disorder and that it has a genetic component. She notes that it runs in her family, so she has a predisposition to it. Her major depressive disorder went undiagnosed until, at age 38, she checked herself into a hospital to detox from what had become round-the-clock use of alcohol and cocaine. In the hospital, after a number of sessions with a psychiatrist talking about her substance use, her emotions, and why she drank, the psychiatrist told her he believed she had major depressive disorder and that she had been self-medicating, probably since she was a kid, and compulsively ate to soothe herself. Then, as she got older, she self-medicated with alcohol and drugs. Lisa describes her substance use as having been a way to quiet the voice in her head that told her she wasn't good enough or smart enough or pretty enough. That voice in her head told her life was pointless and just a series of sad and painful events. On many days, that voice told her not to get out of bed because she was worthless and life was useless. She shut that voice down first with food and then with alcohol and drugs. The psychiatrist put Lisa on antidepressants and told her that going forward, she would treat her depression with appropriate medication instead of drugs and alcohol. Almost 15 years later, she still treats her depression with medication and talk therapy, which she will continue to do. She sees her story as a continuous line. She had a genetic predisposition towards substance use disorder. That was coupled with an underlying undiagnosed depressive disorder, which she self-medicated. When she added in the stressful, exhausting routine of a life as a junior associate in big corporate law, it was more than she could handle on her own, and her drinking and drug use took over. Lisa spends a lot of time these days helping others and working to eliminate the stigma around discussing mental health and substance use issues. I hope the stories we've shared today send a clear message that you are not alone and that help is available and recovery is possible. I first disclosed my struggles with depression in March 2018 in an article in the New York Law Journal. The response to the article was humbling. I received hundreds of emails in which people shared, sometimes for the first time, their own experiences. I learned that there are a lot of people suffering in isolation, not knowing what they're going through or otherwise impacted by the struggles or loss of loved ones. And many, too, dedicate their time and energy to helping others. I was touched and inspired. So I got together with another attorney who I knew had struggled with mental health issues, and we launched an online support group for attorneys dealing with mental health issues. In only 4 months, we have more than 100 members, and all of our services and technology are provided at no cost to members. We have a web forum, chat group, and a video conferencing technology for use by members. We call it the Lawyers Depression Project, LDP. It's a grassroots project aimed at addressing depression and other mental health issues in the legal profession. The LDP is comprised of attorneys, law students, law school graduates, and others in the legal field who are diagnosed at one point or another in their lives with major depression, bipolar disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, general anxiety disorder, or another mental illness. It is also for those who are suffering but not formally diagnosed, or simply feel that something isn't right but have not sought formal mental help. We want you to know that if you're suffering, you're not alone, and there's a great deal of benefit in connecting with others who are dealing with similar issues. We host a confidential forum at www.notime.com and weekly online peer-to-peer support group meetings. We offer the members the option of anonymity. Meetings involve candid explorations of health and mental health experiences, impacts on legal practice, and tools for effective management and work-life practice. Please do not hesitate to contact me in confidence, and thank you for your time and attention. As Dr. Fraser Crane would say, I wish you good day and good mental health. Thank you.
What if I told you that a retrovirus that infected your ancestors tens of thousands of years ago could make you more susceptible to addiction? While the science on the effects of this retrovirus on the complex reward pathways in the brain are fascinating, it is not meant to serve as an excuse for addiction, nor is it a call for more genetic testing. Rather, I want to break free from the ways we typically think of addiction. 1, as a character flaw. 2, as being a socioeconomic problem. And 3rd, and most importantly, as someone else's problem. Before we get started, we need to cover some basic terminologies. I'm sure you've heard and seen the term addiction and abuse used a lot in the popular press. And for the longest time, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is the psychiatric book that contains all the substance use disorders, as well as the mental disorders, had diagnosis for both substance abuse and dependence. But as of May 2013, with the introduction of the DSM-5, the mental health community came out and with the revised guidelines that actually eliminated that distinction and just used the term use disorders, whether it be alcohol or something else. Why did they do that? In part because there was a stigma associated with dependence and abuse that made some doctors hesitant to make the diagnosis. There was also a realization that of all these problems that we see in the substance abuse space, they lie in a continuum. The debate now is what constitutes addiction on this continuum, and that debate is still ongoing. For our discussion, an even more fundamental question is what constitutes a drink? Does a can of light beer equal a Long Island iced tea? As you may have guessed, it does not. We standardize drinks by the alcohol content. 1 can of beer equals 1 5-ounce glass of wine, and yes, that's the small pour you get in restaurants, equals 1.5 ounces of 80 proof liquor. The other term used a lot in the literature is binge drinking. A useful definition of binge drinking is drinking a substantial quantity of alcohol in a short period of time with an intent to get intoxicated. In other words, drinking to get drunk. You might think, isn't that why we drink in the first place? That might be the first indication you have a problem. Kidding aside, there is a distinction between getting buzzed and being completely intoxicated. There's also a difference between drinking 2 or 3 glasses of wine and ending up drunk and taking shot after shot with the explicit purpose of getting drunk as fast as possible. So within the health community, there may be an overlap, but there's a distinction. As we say, these conditions lie in a continuum. There are several more formal definitions of binge drinking. The first, which defines binge drinking as a pattern of drinking causing you to be above the driving limit, legal limit for alcohol, that one is very similar to the definition I used. Another definition is drinking 5 or more drinks on one occasion in the past 30 days. If you think about the second definition, it's not terribly difficult to meet its requirements. Focusing back on substance abuse not being someone else's problem. Based on the latest data we have, the best estimates of the prevalence of alcohol use disorder in the general population is 6 to 7%. Realizing that these are self-reports from survey data, it would not be surprising if the actual numbers were slightly higher. As you can see, binge drinking has a special significance in terms of economic consequence, $187 billion to be precise, which explains why it's a focus of a lot of publications. And for some perspective, the number of alcohol-related deaths doubles the number of opioid-related deaths in the United States annually. Yet opioids are all over the news. The difference is probably related to the fact that most people don't die of acute alcohol intoxication. So the role of alcohol in human health and disease is much more insidious and less likely to get attention. But in the legal community, the picture for alcohol use is quite different than the general population. There are two major studies that I want to share with you. The first was a study conducted in 1990 with a survey of roughly 1,200 lawyers from the state of Washington. Again, this is a study relying on self-reported information, so the results probably underestimate the actual rate of alcohol use. But it is an apples-to-apples comparison to the way we generate the data for the general population, which can be illustrative here. The rate of problematic drinking the authors expected to see in this population was roughly 10%. And the reason that's higher than the 6 to 7% currently we see in the general population is because there has been a slight downward trend in alcohol use within the general population. But what the authors actually found as a result of their study was 18% problematic drinking amongst lawyers. They also found a significantly higher than expected rate of depression among the participants. Now, having lived in Seattle, I'm not sure how much of the depression data were weather-related, but it certainly would not explain the totality of the difference. So in 1990, this study found problematic drinking among lawyers was more than double the rate in the general population. May not be surprising. In 2016, there was a much more robust study conducted, this time with nearly 13,000 licensed and practicing lawyers across multiple states. Emphasize that these were licensed and practicing lawyers, not disbarred or not out-of-a-job lawyers, actually practicing. This time, the rate of problematic drinking was even higher, 21%, and approaching 2.5 times the rate seen in the general population. And the numbers were higher than the general population across various legal demographics. The rate was higher among male lawyers versus males in the general population. The rate was higher among female lawyers than females in the general population. Young or old, the rates were higher amongst lawyers than the general population. And as you can see, the problem exists both in lawyers who practice in big law settings as well as those who are in-house attorneys. And in case you believe these numbers just simply reflect the stress of the job and the personality types that are attracted to law, there are authors who have looked at the prevalence of alcohol use among surgeons, another type A personality that has a lot of stress. And both in 1990 and 2012, where there's data available, the rate of alcohol use disorders among surgeons has held steady at 15%. Yes, higher than the national average, but lower than for lawyers. What does that mean in practical terms? Putting aside small numbers and statistical nuances, that would mean that 1 out of every 5 lawyers has a drinking problem. Most in-house legal departments number greater than 5. Many top law firms have 500 or more lawyers. Statistically, 1 in 5 lawyers at your company, 1 in 5 lawyers working for you on your matters has a drinking problem. It is your problem. How do we deal with the problem in our community, in our workplace, in our social circles? The first obstacle is detection. Most people can probably name 1 or 2 folks they know may have a drinking problem, but not 10% of their friends and family, not 20% of their coworkers or attorneys that work with them or they interact with regularly. The second problem is even among those who we can identify, we generally don't intervene. How many times have you actually done something when you believed a colleague had a drinking problem? Did you actually have a conversation with that person and say, look, I'm your friend, I'm your coworker, I think you may have a problem? That is an unlikely possibility. And why is it important to intervene? If we just intervene with the people who actually want to be helped, Realizing we may not know who those people are, we could make a significant difference. If you look at the statistics for the general population, not specific to lawyers, and you identify those who we know have a substance use disorder, alcohol or drugs, and you ask them, okay, you think you need treatment? Only about 5% admit they have a problem. And that's not unexpected. But in that group, those who have recognized they have a problem, only about a third seek help. Doesn't mean they actually even get help, but they at the minimum just seek it. If we can motivate the other 2/3 of individuals who know they have a problem, but are not making an effort to seek help, to actually do seek that help, we could theoretically triple those getting help. And that is a significant step forward. To be perfectly clear, since 19 out of 20 people with a problem are in denial, your offer to help is likely to get rejected a few times before you find someone who may be willing to listen. But that's okay. How many times do we file a motion to dismiss even when the odds of success are low? And you don't have to be a trained mental health professional to talk to someone about seeking help. Just engage them in the conversation. You'll be surprised how many times people will actually admit to you that they may need your help. There have been many times when I've had patients in clinic and asked them, do you feel sad? Do you think you might actually have a concern about hurting yourself? And all of a sudden, that person will open up and say, oh my gosh, I've been thinking about hurting myself. You're the first person to ask me that question ever. And the thought that goes through the back of your mind is, why hasn't anyone asked this question of this person before? And we all know the answer to that. Because it's a hard topic to discuss, and it's much, much, much easier to pretend everything is okay, or to explain away red flags. And many have the belief that if a person ever really needed help, he or she would say something. But in reality, that person is likely to be very scared and confused of being judged, of the consequences, both at home and work, of saying something, of the hard path to recovery. Ms. Smith's story in the Washington Post captures some of these concepts well. She was a successful lawyer in New York while suffering from alcohol and drug use disorders. And she lived with the fear all the while she tried to keep her professional life together. Back when I was in training, we used a tool called the CAGE questionnaire to quickly screen for problematic drinking. 4 simple questions validated over and over again in studies. 2 yeses are highly sensitive and specific for alcohol abuse under the old diagnostic scheme. Again, these conversations may not come up in the work environment because we tend not to criticize people about their drinking, but perhaps they could come up in a home environment. The G asks if you ever felt guilty about your drinking, whether that's because of the consequence of your drinking or legal or personal health that resulted from drinking. The last one is something that we could observe in the work environment, E for eye-opener. If you're traveling for work and you interact with folks, you notice the same person after each night of drinking requires a morning alcoholic beverage. That should be a red flag. Again, objective observation that can help you identify problematic drinking in your colleagues. Of course, you can always engage the person by asking, have you ever considered cutting back on your drinking? And if the person responds, stop annoying me, I feel guilty enough as it is, well, you already have your 2 criteria and you're done. When we're talking about binge drinking, it's also important to realize that binge drinking is a red flag for alcohol use problems in and of itself. By way of an example, on a Wednesday night, you happen to be at a social gathering with a colleague, and in the midst of that social gathering, you have a couple of drinks with that colleague, and you both go home. You both show up the next day early because you have a big project to work on. And your colleague has not only shown up to work early, but he or she has hit the gym before coming to work. You wouldn't think anything of it. No one would think that person has a drinking problem. But would your thinking change if the facts were that while you had those 2 drinks, your colleague had 10 shots? Does that raise a red flag for you? Or does it simply make it more impressive that your colleague was able to get in a workout and show up to work early despite the 10 drinks? What if your colleague had 15 drinks in the same span of time it took you to have 2? What about 20? Why do I bring this up? I think we were too quick to dismiss the warning sign. And that brings us to the diagnostic criteria. There are formal diagnostic criteria for alcohol use disorder. There are 11 of them. 2 to 3 criteria translate to mild use disorder, meaning 4 to 5 would be called moderate use disorder, and 6+ is considered severe use disorder. Note that the debate I mentioned earlier is where we draw the line of addiction within this continuum, and whether it's somewhere below or less than severe use disorder, and whether or not something less than a severe use disorder can qualify as addiction. One question I'm often asked is how much is too much when it comes to alcohol use? There's no precise answer, but we do have some observational data. The way this is addressed was asking people how much alcohol they consumed in the past week. This is a better measure than a daily measurement of drinking because drinking can fluctuate depending on the day of the week. And just to better orient folks, we can back calculate the average daily total by dividing by 7. So 14 drinks a week on average translates to 2 drinks per day. Obviously, we don't know if that's actually 2 drinks per day, which doesn't sound like a lot. Or it's 6 days of sobriety followed by 14 drinks every Sunday while watching football, which would seem like a lot. But let's assume it's the former, that the daily average is roughly the same every day. Now ask yourself, how many drinks constitutes too many? 4 drinks per day or 28 drinks per week? 5 drinks per day or 35 drinks per week? 7 drinks per day or 49 drinks per week? If you think more than 50 drinks per week is not unusual, that's about 2 bottles of hard liquor or about 10 bottles of wine, I suspect you're in the minority. But you would still be at the 50th percent of the weekly consumption of alcohol for the top 10% of individuals in the United States. The data broken down by decile shows that about 30% of folks don't drink at all. And you have another 20% that drink very little. Those would be considered occasional drinkers. You get to the 80th to 90th percentile, and that's 15 drinks per week, which translates to roughly an average of 2 per day, which I think very few people consider that to be too many. If you go to the next group, you all of a sudden jump not quite an order of magnitude, but a half order of magnitude to 10.5 drinks per day. That's a lot of alcohol. But that goes back to my observation that I've seen people put away a lot of alcohol, even a bottle, within a short span of time. And there are folks that when you interact with them, for lunch, for example, have 5 or 6 drinks. And if they're having 5 or 6 drinks for lunch, chances are they're having 5 or 6 drinks for dinner, they're having drinks after dinner, and probably drinking at breakfast too. And you can see how a person can rack up 10 or 10 and a half drinks per day. Or you could have someone who drinks a 6-pack or 2 after work every day. Now, we need to put this in perspective. You may say these numbers may be skewed by the fact that there are folks who have chronic alcohol problems who drink an astonishing amount of alcohol. And that may be true. But remember, the prevalence of alcohol use disorder in the general population is only 6 to 7%. So a significant number of people in this top group may not necessarily have a drinking problem. Of course, the reverse of that is also true. I've had people come up and tell me that they interpret this chart to mean that if you're drinking less than 10 drinks a day, you don't have a drinking problem. In fact, you don't have to be in the top 10% to have a drinking problem. Just to share an anecdote, the legal limit for a DUI is typically 0.08. If you take people who rarely drink, if you get their blood alcohol level to about 0.25, they start experiencing serious side effects from alcohol, including the possibility of becoming comatose. Yet, I have discharged a patient with a blood alcohol level of 0.4 as being functionally sober. His blood alcohol level on admission was 0.78. So his blood was on its way to becoming light beer in terms of alcohol content. And if that sounds incredible, imagine this story. A pilot had a blood alcohol level 10 times the legal limit an hour before his flight. Full disclosure, the legal blood alcohol limit for flying commercial planes is lower than driving a car. But his blood alcohol level was between 2 and 3 times the legal limit for driving 1 hour before he was to take the helm of a plane. One important fact to keep in mind is that alcohol withdrawal can actually be a serious health threat. You can quit many drugs cold turkey, albeit with limited success, and not endanger your life. But alcohol can be fatal under certain circumstances. So I would highly recommend seeking professional help. Also know that the diagnostic regime that we have in place for alcohol is the same for other substances as well. So those diagnostic criteria apply equally to opioids, amphetamines, to whatever substance it happens to be. Obviously, if you're snorting cocaine while at work, you have a problem. But most people tend to hide their illicit drug use more from their colleagues at work. I do want to share some bar disciplinary fact patterns, which I think illustrate how things can spiral out of control for a lawyer. Accepting oxycodone pills in exchange for legal services, smuggling heroin in prison to help feed your addiction, your parole officer finding drug paraphernalia after you've been convicted of cocaine possession. I don't know for certain, but I doubt these attorneys had notions of engaging in such behaviors when they went to law school. The point about this isn't that these stories are going to happen to you. The problem with substance abuse, whether it's in the form of alcohol, illicit drug, or prescription medication, is that they tend to achieve their short-term goal. Heroin will get you high, no ifs, ands, or buts. Alcohol can numb the pain or make you more socially relaxed. Ritalin will allow you to stay up and study for the test. And despite all the horrible side effects people talk about, the chemistry of these drugs allow you to achieve those short-term goals. And even if you know that opioids can cause respiratory arrest, that alcohol can cause liver cirrhosis, that Ritalin can cause heart attack and strokes, and ultimately death, it is often the case that long before you die, you will experience other serious psychological side effects from substance use disorders. It is the effect on your body's ability to control pain when you're using heroin, the inability to function without alcohol when you're abusing alcohol, or the loss of motivation when you're using the amphetamine derivatives that are likely to ruin your life first. But remember, context matters. We've been told drugs ruin your life. So if you're on drugs, your life must be in shambles. And if you're not on drugs, your life must be going fine. But it turns out that some of the signs of drug use and misappropriation come out when the person's actually trying to quit. And I just want to use the example of Ritalin, which is an amphetamine derivative. So if you have an associate or a subordinate who turns everything in on time, sleeps only 3 hours a day, and seems like he or she's in the office 20 hours at a time, working really hard, you think to yourself, well, that person's doing great. That person shouldn't have a problem. That person has a bright future. You don't think twice about it. But assume for the sake of argument, that person is using Ritalin or another derivative of amphetamine to stay awake, to be able to focus, to do the work. As I mentioned, these drugs actually do provide some degree of assistance on that front. Then that person goes, well, my project is over. Maybe I should stop using these drugs. And he or she cuts down. Because of the way these drugs work, especially in adults, the drug is meant to essentially be a motivation engine for you. And while it's motivating you, your body's own internal motivation structure starts to shut down. Your body basically thinks, well, if the drug is going to do the work for me, I'm not going to do the work. And once you quit, you may not be able to motivate yourself again. I might be oversimplifying it a bit, but you get the idea. And a lot of folks who have taken these stimulants and go off the drug, once they're off of it, they realize they just don't have a lack of motivation, or they start to procrastinate, but they have no motivation to do anything at all. Even if there's a deadline, it doesn't matter. So this person now goes from being a superstar on an amphetamine to being someone who's missing deadline, who doesn't seem to be motivated because she's not off the drug. By virtue of the way we reward excellence at work, and we criticize people for not doing their job or pulling their weight, we might think, well, you know what? You're really not pulling your own weight. You're not doing as well of a job as I thought you were doing. And you end up punishing the person for being off the drug. Again, what I want to do here is to break us from the rigid thinking that if things are going well, then everything is okay. When things are going bad, there must be something going on. It may be the other way around. It may be reverse causation. The key is engage, because you never know what's going to happen. I tried to create a modified list based on my experience that would make it easier for you to remember. Behavioral changes are important. It doesn't matter which direction. It may be that the baseline behavior for a person is more erratic than when he or she is under the influence. Remember that many drugs are actually central nervous system depressants, like alcohol. So it's important to know what a person's baseline is. Obviously, the more you know someone, a better position you would be in to know what their baseline is and whether or not their personality is deviating from that baseline. And that's the key point, deviation from baseline. Hypervigilance. That's one of those things where someone is overly focused on something. Because I do think a lot of times we think that it's just a person being a good type A personality pattern, it can be overlooked. And it may well be that the person is a good type A personality, but it may also be substance abuse, and it's an important concept. Emotional volatility. It's different from erratic behavior because erratic behavior can include suspicion and paranoia, whereas emotional volatility focuses on mood, happy, sad. If someone is a pretty stable person and that changes, that's a reason for concern. Regardless, it's certainly worth asking what's going on. And it's also important to remember that for folks whose job is the cornerstone or the foundation of their personal identity, which may be true for many lawyers, they will go to great lengths to preserve their status at work despite serious deterioration in their overall mental health from a substance use disorder. If your work is your sense of identity, you may allow your home life to crumble, your financial life to crumble, but you still do your best to maintain your work reputation. That is important to you. For these folks, they may have a horrible home life, and you may not know about it because they're functioning just fine at work. This is sometimes referred to as high-functioning alcoholics, for example. But the more you know about your coworker, the more insights you would have beyond their work arena. Avoid enabling your coworkers, whether you're talking about your boss or your subordinates. Don't make excuses for them. Don't take over responsibility. This may allow them to continue to work while impaired. And I have identified what may seem obvious, but overlooked aspects of open communication. Don't analyze, don't judge, don't compare, blame, or justify. On the judging point, I know as lawyers, we love to judge risks and benefit, and our work is oftentimes literally judged. While it's easy to use your own life lens to judge a situation, that can be very problematic. It's sometimes said that you cannot have a drinking problem if you drink less than your doctor, which illustrates why using a personalized standard to evaluate others can be an issue. And if asked, most people will say, I'm a very open person, and I consider myself very tolerant, and I realize that substance abuse is a real illness. But I would submit we're not as open, tolerant, and non-judgmental as we like to believe we are. Implicit bias is a burgeoning field of study, and there's data to support the assertion that we all have our own biases. And that may adversely impact the framework of the discussion about substance abuse. There's been a lot of debate, and I'll put this out there for full disclosure because there are those who strongly believe that group therapy is the key to successful quitting of a substance use. It turns out if you look at the data is actually mixed on the efficacy of group therapy, and it is really an individualized question. If you're one of those individuals who believes that group therapy is not going to work because it's going to bore you, then you're not going to do well in group therapy. And if you're one of those who believes that unburdening is a key component of getting help, then it might help you. But what's key is you don't have to make that decision. All you have to do is motivate the individual to get help. A healthcare professional, a mental healthcare professional, will devise the best possible program for the individual. And the bar has lawyer assistance programs for every jurisdiction, including multiple in California. And I put the website there so you can see that. And they offer comprehensive services, whether it's substance abuse, mental illness, or both. I'm sure I've given you a lot to think about today, and hopefully several things to be mindful of about yourself and your colleagues. If 1 in 5 lawyers has a substance use problem, our profession needs each and every one of us to do our part to help others recognize it and seek assistance. Thank you for watching.